Welcome to Belmont Poetry Night. I'm Monica Korde, your host and the Poet Laureate of Belmont, California. We meet on the third Tuesdays of every month to celebrate the spoken word as makers, listeners, and admirers of poetry. We come with featured guests and an open mic, inviting readers of all ages. After gathering for several years at our favorite physical venue, the Belmont Library, since the pandemic, our thriving poetry circle has transitioned to this virtual space, and I'm grateful this allows me to welcome poets and listeners from across the globe. And it always puts me in the best of moods to see such a delightful gathering each month. It would be wonderful to know where you are joining me from. So, as per our poetry night tradition, please share in the chat. And once again, thank you all for joining me and zooming in. To start with, when I was curating this poetry night in the theme of grief, loss, and love, I did not realize that spring was coming in a day early due to the leap year, and that today actually marks the first day of vernal equinox. So now, as I think of it in relation to our theme, I can't help but wonder how the tilting of the earth into spring is not only a cue of the warmer days that are on our doorstep, but it also acts as a reminder of the yin and yang that exists in nature. With light and dark in equal amounts, the equinox symbolically represents balance, harmony, and new beginnings, while signifying the importance of staying in tune with the changing of seasons. And much like the changing of the seasons, life too is an intricate journey where we traverse through various stages, experiences, and emotions, from immense joy to deep grief and everything in between. Here's a poem by Victoria Chang that is at once fascinating and deeply ruminative, written as an obituary to grief from her book, Obit. Grief, as I knew it, died many times. It died trying to reunite with other lesser deaths. Each morning I lay out my children's clothing to cover their grief. The grief remains, but is changed by what it is covered with. A picture of oblivion is not the same as oblivion. My grief is not the same as my pain. My mother was a mathematician, so I tried to calculate my grief. My father was an engineer, so I tried to build a box around my grief, along with a small wooden bed that grief could lie down on. The texts kept interrupting my grief, forcing me to speak about nothing. If you cut out a rectangle of a perfectly blue sky, no clouds, no wind, no birds, frame it with a blue frame, place it face up on the floor of an empty museum with an open atrium to the sky. That is grief. Thank you. That final imagery of grief is so striking, isn't it? Such an illuminating exploration into an all-consuming emotion as grief that is followed by the experience of loss. And if you notice the clarity Chang brings in through language in those lines, my grief is not the same as my pain. We often attempt to understand something by comparison, by the scope of it, making sense of the emotional burdens we carry, learning to manage it somehow. About writing this poetry collection, Chang said, "It was my attempt to see if I could get to the bone of grief." And I think you will find this very thought echo again through the poems and conversation I'll be having with my wonderful featured poet and visual artist joining us from Nevada tonight, Kathy Nelson. With all of you listening on, I'd like to read her introduction first. A Southerner by upbringing and a New Jersey resident for much of her adult life, Kathy Nelson has been a Nevadan since 2021. Kathy earned an MFA in poetry from the Warren Wilson Program for Writers in Swannanoa, North Carolina, where she studied with Marianne Boruch and Martha Rhodes. Throughout her careers in teaching, engineering, and chaplaincy, she has read, studied, and written poetry. Her poems appear in many respected journals, including 5 Points, a journal of literature and art, Tar River Poetry, New Ohio Review, Verse Daily, and others. She has 2 poetry chapbooks and most recently a full-length collection of poems, The Ledger of Mistakes. It's a wonderful book. I have a copy of that, and I'm really happy that Kathy shared that book with me. So thanks again, Kathy. Published in 2023 by Terrapin Books. And Kathy is also a recipient of a 2024 Nevada Arts Council Fellowship. A warm welcome to you, Kathy. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Monica. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you to the familiar faces in the Zoom world that I'm seeing on the screen. Thank you so much for coming, my Carson City, Nevada pals and California pals, Oregon pals. Thank you. By way of introducing my book, The Ledger of Mistakes, I would like to say that I think one of the most complex of human relationships is between mothers and daughters. The daughter has a strong impulse to bond with the mother, to be close to the mother, to seek her approval and her love. But she also has an equally strong impulse to differentiate herself from her mother, to separate and have a separate, independent life from the mother. The Ledger of Mistakes remembers the complexity of a particular mother-daughter relationship within a particular context of grief and loss. And I'd like to begin with a poem that opens with a photograph from my childhood. Easter, 1956. The magnolia blossoms in the wallpaper behind us, her straw cloche scattered with lilacs. My face shines in the flash, stiff organza, netted rosebud headband. My mother tilts her head toward me, smiling. I slide the photo from its frame again to see her hand reaching, the way my hem drapes across her fingers, not so much restraining as inviting, coaxing me to defer escape from the camera frame. Not quite forbearance, not quite melancholy. Once in a dream, I awoke from numb forgetting, remembered, oh, the longing, a daughter I'd never known, lost in the night. On the horizon, beacons shone, but I stumbled in a canyon of talus slopes and boulders. I never had the dream again, and it's just as well. A person could be destroyed by such hopelessness. I have been my mother and I have been my daughter. I have driven slowly along a curb, cajoling my girl, honey, please get back in. And I have raced along a corridor, a walker scraping behind me, a plaintive voice calling my name. I've lied, and I've been the one lied to, the advocate and the adversary, the swatter and the fly, the witness and the one afraid to look. I have shrunk from the cliff's edge, and I have marveled at the possibilities of flight. In my own family history, I recently noticed a pattern. When the daughters in my family tree have left their mothers in order to launch into their own lives, those mothers have offered not a blessing, but a confusing combination of generosity and anger, a mixture of love and shame. How strange women can be. My father, just home from the war, Hawaiian girls, cigarettes, Midway locked in his ditty box, the key dropped in the Pacific. But not to stay. The GI Bill, the lure of a college town, the same endless wind-wrecked plain as home. But the world so much wider. And there she is, his will-be wife, my mother, not so foreign as the island girls, but glamorous, lipstick, sultry film star smile, the tiny gap between her teeth, an invitation, not like the plain girl at home his mother mentioned every letter, docile, modest in the front pew. The wedding, pearls, magnolia blossoms, Gulf damp heat. The groom's sister crying, the bride's cousins smirking, sipping at their pocket flasks. A bill shoved hard along the bride's wrist into her sleeve, her mother's hiss, enough to get you home when you wake up and see the mistake you've made. My father beside my mother in the car, her hand in his. With the cash, she buys him a gold band. In the midst of all this complexity between mothers and daughters, what would we daughters do without the loving neighbor or aunt who is free simply to love us without demanding anything of us? Doily. No idle twiddle, but a worry of thumbs, a whirring pad over nail over pad behind the little wall of Aunt Winnie's interlaced fingers, her movie star lacquered nails, the only thing about her that wasn't plain. The ample body, the broad forearms, the homemade dress. She sat beside me, coaxing. That's it, pull through the loop and snug it up. Chain, slip stitch, half double crochet. Across the room, Jesus's flaming, bleeding, thorn-wrapped heart shone from a frame. How could a child not ponder suffering? The thread in my fumbling fingers turned to chaos. She gently freed my hands, sweet-talked the mess, danced the hook, first one way, then the other, showing me again. My goodness a given. Imagine the threat to my mother with her list of improvements. It didn't matter whether I was nice, cute, smart, thin, pretty, charming, fun to be around. Aunt Winnie filled my cup with sugar and milk and tinged with a splash of bitter coffee to heighten the sweet. She sorted her crochet hooks by size. So do I.
Those were beautiful pieces, Kathy. Thank you so much for opening with that really deep and profound piece. If I could just go back to those lines from your Easter poem, the concluding lines especially. I have shrunk from the cliff's edge, and I have marveled at the possibilities of flight. And I see that this image or this stone, it's like a thread that goes through each of your poem, where the speaker is really marveling at the possibilities of flight at each turn of line. And coming to something that I was thinking of while you were reading as well, and having looked at some of your work, I was reminded of poet Jane Hirschfield, who wrote that to step into a poem is to agree to risk. And the process of meditating and writing on deep sadness is, in a reflective poetic space, can be therapeutic and cathartic, but it can also feel like a great emotional risk when you open yourself up to such vulnerability. And I want to hear more about how you arrived at making space for ache and suffering, to move through mourning with patience, grace, acceptance, and forgiveness during the writing and editing stages of your poetry.
Yes, thank you for that question. It is a deep emotional risk. It is. But, during the end of my mother's life, um, I only did by the way, I haven't said that my mother had Alzheimer's disease, and which many of you may know is a very slow, often a very slow, painful, in many ways painful decline. During that period, I only did the kind of writing one does when the water has reached this little spot right below the nostrils. I wrote journal entries. I wrote rants. I wrote lists of medications. I wrote doctor's appointments. I was continually recording whatever was the latest tragedy that had occurred. I was not aware of how vulnerable I was because I had too much to do during that period, and I wasn't writing poems. What I was writing was angst. It was an entire year after she died before poems began to come to me. And when they did, it was like the floodgates had opened and they all began spilling out. One of the poets that I turn to is Gregory Orr. He has a book called Poetry as Survival, about how poetry saved him after a childhood trauma. And I think I share with him the experience of finding that as I shaped poems and gave them form, the experience of grief and loss became something that had its own independent existence outside of myself. It was no longer something I had to carry around with me all the time. It had its own life. And for me, this was absolutely necessary. So yes, the vulnerability is a risk, but it feels like an essential part of the process.
I hear you, Kathy, and I really like this thought that you mentioned, that you had a place for it and it had its own life. And I think that is one of the biggest takeaways from this conversation that we are just getting into, is that just like the poem said by Victoria Chang, that the grief remains, it is only changed by what you cover it with. So I see that that poetry gave it a place, and you really created an individual space for it. So yeah, thank you for sharing those thoughts. If you'd like to go on to a couple of poems again, and before taking
Sure,
the next question, Kathy.
sure. So I mentioned Alzheimer's disease, and many of you may know that it is brutal. My mother lost the ability to read a calendar or to find her way out of a store. She lost the ability to make sound decisions. Tragically, she became paranoid and violent. She lost all but the most rudimentary language. She lost the ability to recognize her own child. Our Lady of the Locked Unit. From the Valley of the Shadow, Haldol, Risperidone. My mother wakes, happy as a warbler in pine forest. She's forgotten how to walk, but stands from her wheelchair, teeters like a baby bird perusing air, or like Rodin's old courtesan, or like the cripple at Capernaum. This would be a story about miracles if it weren't so full of sorrow. Hello, beautiful, she sings out to the CNA. To the medtech, I love you. No matter her serrated syllables, he's always cooed, darling, perfect, kissing her cheek, slipping Valium-laced vanilla pudding between her teeth. In the dread-crippled, arthritic, word terminal, decay-doomed room, the lunch tray clatter slows and a line forms. The beleaguered faithful gather for the Holy Mother's blessing. And I, her famished acolyte, don't I ache too for that beneficence? Good morning. Her bony palms unfold the maintenance man's blameless hand. One of the things I learned during my mother's decline is that caregivers of people with dementia have an elevated risk of developing dementia themselves as a result of the extreme stress of caring for them and keeping them safe. How to unknot a straitjacket. Take the photo of your mother off the wall. Let the blood drain. Don't use a chalice. Make a list of the treasons you've earned. Wreathe them around your neck like skulls. Map the patterns of need in the copperhead scales, remembering her seductive charm. Count the times you ate cake sitting alone in your car, the barbaric crumbs, the sticky plastic fork, the box sagging in the footwell. Reread your instructions to yourself. Do not rescue. Do not suffer. Put at the top of the list of remains the sound of her voice in your throat.
Simply remarkable, Kathy. Especially the way you use language and the movement that language has in your poetry, with the sounds it has, decay, doomed room, or like the lines. There are a lot of lines that have resonated with our listeners, which are in the chat. Take the photo of your mother off the wall. Let the blood drain. And I see that it's really the choice of words that you make, the sounds that those lines carry. It makes a lot of difference as well in the way the poetry comes off. And one of my favorite contemporary poets, Hanif Abdul Rakib, he has talked about how poetry has brought him peace and understanding even in the most troubling times. And to quote him, I believe that I should be a generous steward to my grief. If I tend generously to my grief, then it treats me well in return. That means that each time I'm confronted with the grief, I have a newer depth of tool to move through it. And your poems, Kathy, bear witness to love, loss, and gratitude amid all the hurt. While being a steward to your own grief, how do you think grief and immense loss can be conveyed to others? And also, talking about writing as a tool to move through it, can you speak about the ways in which you approach language and the internal architecture of your poetry?
Yes, and by the way, I wanted to say something about Victoria Chang since you read her poem. Obit is one of my favorite books. I love that book. And in the context of your question, the architecture of the poems, each of those poems is this tiny little column, nice, neat little column, very constrained little column on the page, just like a newspaper obituary would be. It's very, but the containment, the the similarity of one poem from one page to the next is part of how she is creating that experience, the emotional experience of the book. One of my favorite poets is Ellen Bryant Voigt, and I've learned so much from her essays. And one of the things that she says that I always think about is she says that what's crucial in the writing of a poem is to prioritize not what happened, but what was felt. And I have made myself a student of this way of writing poems. I study poems to see how they create an emotional experience. Is it the images in the poem? Is it the musical elements that create an emotional tone? Is it repetition? Is it rhythm? What form will evoke the emotional experience I'm trying to create in a poem? The pantoum has an inherent obsessive quality, while the sonnet has a whole different impact. What kinds of diction will communicate the frustration or the yearning I want the reader to feel? And the line lengths, these are all craft choices. And I find that becoming a craftsman in order to write a poem about emotionally fraught material is right at the center of the question of survival. Something about becoming a craftsman is very much in concert with survival.
Right. Thank you, Kathy, for mentioning those really essential tips, and also some which works as a guide to those forms that you mentioned, especially. And much like the waves of grief, I noticed there is a rising and falling in the flow of your poems as well, which is simply remarkable. Would you like to share another poem, or maybe before I pose my next question, I can pull up your artwork and we can just hover
Sure,
over it for a couple of minutes?
sure.
Okay, perfect. I'll just need a moment. If everyone can please let me know that they see everything clearly, that'll be great. I'll just put it on slideshow view so it's clear. There we go. I hope all of you can see that.
I see what you're sharing. I see the flyer for the evening.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Let's move forward then. There we have some of your initial artworks that you shared, Kathy. If you'd like to just give us a little bit of an insight into maybe what inspires you and uh, the process of it. And I also have a question for you, but yeah, let's just start with this one, and then maybe on the next slide, I will have the question for you.
Well, you can see on the right-hand side what I think of as my journaling, which is a combination of words and drawing or painting. I have journals that are combinations of drawing of watercolor sketches and words. Somehow that combination very much appeals to me. I don't know what to say about the plant on the left. I think it was the color really that made me want to make this painting. The light on the plant. I love the contrast between dark and light, between complementary colors.
And it is really beautiful, Kathy. That is exactly what I noticed as well when I saw the painting first, the play of light and shadow in there. And it is a watercolor, right?
Yes.
And I also see in your sketch, I really admire in sketches a lot. And I see that you've the lines scribbled around it say, "How I start most mornings a poem, a gratitude, a rant. And you did mention a rant, well, initially before getting into the process of writing grief poetry.
Yes.
Well, that's really wonderful. Moving on to the next slide. This one is called Before Church, and I see that it is done in oil. And here's my question to you, Kathy. I came across one of your interviews where you say that poetry speaks to everybody. Not everybody listens, but it speaks to everyone. And I feel this is true for several art forms as well. For you, expressing yourself in two distinct yet equally inspiring and healing mediums, as a visual artist and a poet, how do you decide when something should take the form of a poem or a painting? And do you combine your work as a visual artist and poet?
Yes, I do. Actually, how do I decide? I don't decide. I don't decide. It's just they are. It's like they come from two different parts of my brain. And it depends on which part of the brain is active that on that particular day, I think. But the processes are similar in that both of them, both writing and painting, are they are essentially just paying attention to what I see, paying attention to color, paying attention to words, paying attention to rhythms.
Mm,
Um, so they are both the same activity, really, paying attention. But my experience of them is, I was thinking about this, my experience of them is different in that
mm,
with, this is my grandfather, by the way, me and my grandfather. Um, and it's a picture, it's from a photograph that I had seen all my life. And I wanted to respond to it in some way.
mm,
And I wanted to make it mine, I think. So it started with paying attention to something that was right in front of me. And the emotional response really came out of the experience of making the painting.
mm,
Whereas when I write a poem, it's often the opposite. I start with an emotional response of some kind, and I try to create something that conveys that emotional response.
mm.
So they feel like a different process in that way, although they are fundamentally coming from the same experience.
Right. Yeah, that's really well put, and so interesting to hear your thoughts on both of these artistic mediums. And as you were talking about it, Kathy, I was just thinking, moving on to your next painting as well. After you're done with the painting, do you ever use those paintings as your ekphrastic for ekphrastic poetry?
Have I ever done that? I I don't think I have, although what I have done is my husband is a photographer and a printmaker, and
Mm,
he and I have collaborated a couple of times, and we've used one of his images and one of my poems and put them together. And it has really been surprising to both of us that what results from that putting together those two things is something larger than either one of them was
mm.
beforehand. It's really expansive, which I've been very pleased about.
Mm, mm. That's really a unique way to look at things as well, and gives us a wholesome perspective when you look at different angles and different ways of looking, basically. And looking at this painting, your poems evidently hold that space for grief, and like you said, they take their own life in there. Do any of your paintings also hold that space, or mostly in these paintings that we are looking at we don't see that happening, but does that emotion figure in them as well?
I think the painting of my grandfather it holds a yearning.
Mm.
It holds a yearning. Yes. Um,
Yeah, one definitely gets a sense of that as we keep observing or looking at that painting.
mhm, mhm. One of my favorite parts about this painting is the Band-Aid on his forefinger.
Ah, I do notice it now. Yeah, you have to look really close.
He was a very simple man,
Yeah.
led a life as a farmer. Um,
Mm.
and he was very loving grandfather.
That's a beautiful memory to have.
Mhm.
Anything about this one, Kathy, that you'd like to share?
I feel so inarticulate about my painting, except just to say, again, it's the dark and light, it's the complementary colors, that's what delighted me in this image and what I tried to capture. Yeah.
Yeah, I also love the shine or the sheen on those onions. They're beautifully captured in there. And
Mhm.
then we come to the last one, I guess, the hydrangea, and this is a beautiful one in watercolors as well.
Yes,
And
and
do you often take walks around or
yeah,
are thinking about something before you do a piece like that?
yes, yes. But this painting, as I recall, this painting started with just laying color onto paper and allowing something to arise out of it.
Mm.
And once began to see floral shapes, then it became a hydrangea. It was not that I started with the hydrangea. It was
Mm.
it was a totally different process.
Wow. And does that happen with your poetry as well? That you start with or
Mm.
think of something and then something completely
Yes,
different happens on the page?
yes, it does. And that is really delightful, actually, when that happens. To just make notes of what you've seen that day. Uh, and then in putting them on paper to begin to see patterns or connections or relationships between those things is really exhilarating, I find.
I'm sure it is, and I think it's just a wonderful gift to have to be able to express yourself in two very artistic and mediums which speak to the audiences so much, and people can relate to it universally. It does not need any language of its own. So thank you, Kathy, for sharing that. While I close our slideshow here, if you would like to take us through another one of your poems, that'll be wonderful. I do have one final question for you after that as well. So
Okay.
a couple of poems or you that you would like to share.
Okay. Um, well, I'll say about this next poem that I wrote all of these poems while living in North Carolina, which is the state with the highest annual number of copperhead snake bites in the country. In fact, at our house in North Carolina, the copperheads would come back because they had been born under our front porch. That's where they came to give birth to their babies. So we dealt with copperheads pretty frequently. And this poem is after Jack Gilbert. I never thought my mother would slip back in after she died. How astonishing that she's arrived as a copperhead living under the porch. I stand on the edge and scan the yard. Mostly, I do not see her. But in August, nearing birthing, she eases onto the asphalt to let the sun soothe the cold from her scales. She coils about the drain spout or stretches along the driveway's grass fringe. I know she is my mother because her slow unspooling beguiles me. I know her because I can't take my eyes off her. I watch with that same stitch at my sternum. If I clear my mind of fear, we might reconcile. I suppress my need for her embrace. I imagine I am not the one who needs escaping. At any moment, her languid looping patterns could break into lightning. My husband unlocks the gun safe, warms up on a paper target. She cares nothing about death. She will return one life to the next until I no longer need her. Shall I read a final poem now, Monica?
Yeah, please go ahead, Kathy. That'll be
Okay.
wonderful. Yeah, one more.
Okay, yes, one more. So there's a lot of sadness in this book, and yet life goes on. We raise our eyes from the grave and we see that we are still alive and that we have others that we love and who love us. And I'd like to finish my reading with one of the last poems in my book. It's a love poem to my husband. It's called Quantum Physics, a Love Poem. I know precisely what he will order from any menu, as well as his latitude, his angle of repose, his f-stop. His warm hands, I'm crazy about them, and his mechanics, his partial differentials. A koala or some other nocturnal animal, he sleeps draped in the armpit of a tree. His smooth, shaved head, his high peaks, his swollen snowmelt streams. I rely on them. And his library of lost saints. He wears socks with his sandals. He kneels, pollen dusted, before the first daffodil. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
That was simply stunning, Kathy. And before I say anything more about what I'm just feeling, I'd like to come to my final question for you. For writers who are trying to give shape, rhythm, architecture to feelings as complex as grief, loss, and love, do you have any general advice about processing loss on the page?
Yes, actually, because I've worked hard at this. Ellen Bryant Voigt, again, one of my teachers. I have over my desk, I have a little card post with a quote from something she says in one of her her essays. She says, poetry is not the transcription, but the transformation of experience. And I think this is really crucial. When I began, I thought that if I just put on the page exactly what happened as it happened, then the reader would understand my experience. And somehow their understanding would help me feel less alone in the experience. But that's not how it works. It doesn't work that way. Just recording an experience doesn't mean others will understand it or grasp its magnitude. Instead, it's the work of crafting an emotional experience in a poem that transforms that experience within us. And that's where the work really happens. So it's back to the previous question about craft. You know, how do we create and then how do we recreate the emotional experience through rhythm, word choice, diction, line length, line breaks, you know, all of those craft elements. That's how the experience gets transformed in my experience.
Mm. Wow. That really makes sense, Kathy, when you say crafting an emotional experience. And what is so remarkable about your poetry is that although there is that crafting or technique or you really a lot of thought process happening to craft that emotional experience, the language does not seem devoid of the warmth or that softness, that tenderness, that understanding of that magnitude of gravity or the deep sadness. So really incredible work, Kathy, and thank you so much for taking us on a journey on the subject of grief, loss, and love. You've really brought to surface all those feelings of hurt and suffering that are really internal and private, that cannot be easily articulated or expressed, perhaps only be felt, but you've really brought them all to life. And I'd love to invite comments from our audience before we close this segment. While I do that, I'll post some links in the chat about Kathy's work. So meanwhile, if anyone would like to take a quick minute, please go ahead and unmute yourself now.
I would just like to add to what Monica was saying about the craft elements, Kathy. And what I would add is that what I got from listening to your poetry is something that I believe goes a little bit beyond craft, no matter how well done. And that is your genuine humility and fearlessness to be open with your feelings really connects, I believe, with the readers and the listeners. So I would say that besides craft, your particular temperament really elevates the work.
Thank you, Robert. That's very kind of you. And I saw the comment go by in the chat if whether the works on the wall are mine. Yes, they are.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that comment to you.
I just want to say that you read your poetry extremely well. I really, enjoyed the way it was presented.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank you. I think the way you read them, there's an honesty to it that I think can be hard to get, sometimes even reading them, sometimes even writing them. I know I wrote some poetry around grief, which actually got me in trouble with family members and created a rift that only recently got resolved. So yeah, there's definitely a risk involved, wherever it comes from. I mean, both the emotional risk of letting something out, but also of sharing it with people and having them decide that it's something other than what you intended. So I do appreciate your reading, and thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your experience with that, because it's a risk.
I just wanted to add that grief is such a deeply personal thing, but it's also such a universal thing felt by everybody, but everybody's experience of it is different. So I love how you said that poetry is not the transcription, but the transformation of that experience. That really resonated. Thank you.
All right, then. Thank you, everyone. Such kind comments, and there's a lot in the chat as well, Kathy, that you can revisit and go back to lines that have resonated with everyone, and just that wonderful feeling of warmth and like a hug. Your poems are really like a hug that everyone really needs in troubling times, and I really echo everyone's thoughts here. The way you read your poetry is so beautiful, and it really brings that to life in your presentation. So thank you, Kathy, once again for your time, your art, and poems that are really a source of consolation, strength, and a springboard for meaningful conversations. I'm really grateful we were all a part of it, and I hope you enjoyed this experience as well.
I loved it. I loved it. And thank you so much for having me.
And I hope, Kathy, that you will stay with us for the open mic, because I'd love to invite you at the end of it to offer us a closing poem. Perfect. All
Yes.
right. Thank you. With that, we are going to stop recording this segment. Those of you who are in the Zoom room, please stay online for the open mic segment of the evening. To the YouTube audience, thanks for tuning in and hope to see you for next month's virtual Belmont Poetry Night. Good night.